I said it last time, but I really need an intro video because I don't fucking have one. Anyway, hi, we're live. My name is James McCool. I am joined by Pablo and special guest Squirrel Patrol, John Breslin this week. We're going to be doing the NFL DFS Slate Talk for Week 11. This is a regular thing. Usually we've been doing this in the Discord over at Paydirt, which is for you to join, of course. But one of the awesome community members over at Paydirt has set me up with a StreamYard. So now we get to stream it, which is way cooler. So this will be recorded. Anybody who is watching now can always rewatch. Anybody who misses it can watch it later. Ask any questions, comments, anything like that. But we're going to be going over a lot of game theory, slate analysis stuff. For those who have not tuned into this Slate Talk, this is much less of the do you play X or Y and much more of how are you supposed to be putting together your lineups for the week. We find it adds a lot more value and there's not enough in space. So without any more of me rambling about what this is, how are you doing today, John? You feeling good today?
Yeah. Good to be here. Thanks for having me on. I've got a lot more free time recently. So, but yeah, looking forward to breaking stuff down with you guys. It's good Saturday night to talk some football. We got some UFC coming up in a little bit. I was just like hammering UFC. So if I recommend John Jones or something, just give me a pass because that was on my brain. But yeah, ready to talk some football.
Did you put any money down on the Tyson Jake Paul fight?
I put like my FanDuel boost. They had like a 30% profit boost or something. I think it was FanDuel. Might have been DraftKings. But I put it on Jake Paul to win by knockout. I put it as like a $20 maximum. It was like not a real.
No,
I didn't watch it, but
Well,
I feel worse off for having watched it. I feel like a worse person for having watched it.
Yeah.
The good news is most people couldn't actually watch it because Netflix couldn't actually make anything work. I watched about 35 seconds of it and then turned it off. I'm not a big boxing guy anyway, so whatever. I really hoped that Tyson would have beat the shit out of him, but he didn't because he's old and it is what it is. So here we are. Pablo, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. I'm excited for tomorrow's slate. One of the Discord members at Paydirt referred to Squirrel Patrol as Squirrel Master. So John, if I refer to you as Squirrel Master, please forgive me, but I do kind of like it. It has good ring to it. Dark Squirrel Patrol, maybe Squirrel Master.
If I had it to do over again, maybe Squirrel Master would have been better. But we're here,
Master Squirrels. Yeah, so this slate, we talked a little bit off camera, and Pablo put together this long write-up because he likes blogging. But it is, I think this slate is really interesting. I think the slate is really interesting mostly because you can't just do kind of the regular heuristics. I talked about this a couple weeks ago, where I think that typically people have an idea of how they want to build a lineup. People would like to do a quarterback plus two of their stacking partners and then bring it back. And you want to have a running back where you pair it with your defense and do all, the whole 9 yards, right? And this slate, I feel like you really can't do a handful of those things, right? Like heuristics are not necessarily going to be something that you can use as a guide for a lot of lineups that you build out. And that's because pricing is really tight this week. Evidence that pricing is really tight is somebody named fucking Keyshawn Boot. I have no idea how to pronounce his name, is projected to be like 20% owned. He has not surpassed 10 fantasy points more than once this year. It was 14 fantasy points in like week 2 or something. And, obviously he's not a very good player, but people are like, well, I need value, so I'm going to just jam this guy in and hope it works. And slates like that, it just kind of speaks to the idea that people want to, everyone kind of has a process that they've gotten into, and especially hand builders, where they feel like they have to build a certain way. And I think people like that struggle really badly with that on slates like this. So Pablo, I know that you wrote up some things. What do you think about this week?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's all that different from the last few weeks, to be honest. This season has become a little more of what I like to think of the way NBA is built, where you kind of have an optimal and you have 2 to 3 pivots. And I think there's a variety of reasons that's happened this year with NFL. I think sims have come much more into play in terms of how people build. I think some of it is pricing related on a given week. Big picture for this week, there's 4 games with higher totals, but really only 2 of the games with the higher totals are expected to be close. I mean, the 4 games with the high totals are, sorry, my computer is freezing at the wrong time, but are Pittsburgh and Baltimore, which is expected to be close, 48.5 total right now. San Francisco, Seattle, where San Francisco's favored by 7. Mm-hmm. Detroit, Jags, where Detroit is favored by 13 of 14. And then Buffalo, KC, which has a 2-point spread, where Buffalo is favored by 2 and a total of 46. So just game environment wise, I think, it's interesting to think about which games will be more competitive. Of course, pricing related to players on those games can help you make decisions as well, right? But I just think it's important to keep in mind what game environments we think are interesting. That being said, I do think that less than game environment is going to be more very specific builds that I think are really obvious based on the chalk right now, unless something changes. And there's not a whole lot of injury news I don't think we're waiting on that's going to change much. We'll talk through that, but I think essentially, it's going to be a few running backs that really dominate ownership with some cheaper plays at tight end, leading to very predictable cash builds. And I think there's a few ways to build leverage off of those to be a little more interesting in win GPPs.
Yeah, John, what do you got for this slate from a high level?
So yeah, I think it is. Pricing is a little bit tight, and I think it's leading to some interesting things. Like you start running some optimal lineups, and like the fact that Kayshon Boutte, I don't know, is in play. I think his name is Boutte, but that could be a joke. So, but yeah, like the fact that he's in play as a wide receiver, I didn't know who he was on Thursday. Means like pricing is really, really tight because he's like 3,600 and he's on the field, I think, for more snaps than any other Patriots wide receiver. And like the Patriots don't have a very high implied point total. So that means that like if you try to add some stacking rules, you start running like optimal lineups, you get a lot of like cheap game environments, not necessarily like high total game environments in your optimal lineups. And I think that's what we're going to see. I think we're going to see like a lot of Jameis Winston lineups because he's cheap and because you can get these like Brown, you can double stack them cheaply, right? And then like you're setting something where like you need to get a run back. There's an obvious run back with Kamara. But, like that game could easily end with the Saints defense having 20 points and Winston having like negative points. So like I think it's a really good game, like really good week to get away from optimal lineups from like high ownership. We're also like week 11, so like we're pretty into the NFL season where like people that are just kind of like shooting off whatever probably aren't playing as much DFS. So yeah, I think it's a good week to get away from some of the optimal lineups. The problem is like, how do you find the value to make that work? Like I really like the idea of like, like playing Lamar Jackson or whatever, or playing, high priced whatever player. Like, how do you make that work without playing a ton of Kayshon Boutte or whoever? So yeah, I think that's kind of my high level.
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, contest sims, I have these pulled up, and I just ran a medium average field. Contest sims are very clear in saying don't spend up at quarterback, right? Like because you can't. Like when you try to build out lineups and compete them against each other in a field, it's like, okay, Lamar Jackson shows up as optimal 2.7% of the time because you have to pair him with Kayshon Boutte or Elijah Moore or, 2 cheap tight ends, right? Like it's just really, really hard to fit him. So what the contest sims are saying is, okay, instead use Brock Purdy mid-range, use Jameis Winston, who's cheap, use Bo Nix, who's 6,200 and has a really cheap pairing partner in Davon Vele. I have no idea how to pronounce his name either. But like a lot of it comes down to you can pair Jameis Winston with a cheap Elijah Moore, and then you can just use anyone around them. You can pair Bo Nix with Davon Vele, who you can pair with whoever after that, right? But if you try to do Lamar Jackson, you're either going with Mark Andrews or Zay Flowers or Rashad Bateman, and Rashad Bateman has seen a bit of a price increase, so that's hard to do. Tua, it's not like you can really afford Tua plus Tyreek Hill effectively, and on top of that, a Kane is a really popular play this week, and he makes sense. So, like, it just comes down to the problem of, if you're going to stack, who are you going to stack and make it work to maximize your correlation? And the answer in the contest sims is basically cheap quarterback with a cheap wide receiver 1 or a cheap tight end that you can pair with. So I think for me, what I said a couple weeks ago was, I don't feel like I should be double stacking this week. Even if I were to use somebody like Brock Purdy, or even if I were to use somebody like Jared Goff, it feels more to me like it's more valuable to just do a QB +1 and then utilize, a cheaper mid-range player or a relatively cheaper player than, who I would have to pair with Brock Purdy. Like getting Brock Purdy plus Deebo Samuel plus George Kittle, I don't even know that you can build a super competitive lineup with that. But you can do Brock Purdy plus George Kittle and then use one of the cheaper wide receivers, or Brock Purdy and Deebo Samuel and one of the cheaper tight ends, and then kind of fill out with mid-range. I think you really need to find a way away from using the cheap wide receivers as one-offs. I think they're fine if you pair them. Like Kayshon Boutte, I'm fine with Kayshon Boutte if you pair him with Drake May. But as a one-off, I don't want to go there. It feels super forced, and a lot of people are going to be doing it. And I just don't think that that's the way to build this week.
Yeah. So I think the common path builds are going to, let's just point out kind of what the common path build is going to be, because I think it's important to understand what the field is generally going to be doing this week. The field is generally going to be taking either Purdy or Winston or one of the other cheap quarterbacks. They're going to use that to get the savings to the three dominant lineup construction players this week are CMC, Kamara, and Achane. Those are by far, I think, the biggest determinants of lineup structure this week. So those components, right? The mid-range to cheap quarterback, double pay up running back, potentially all three if people can make it work, combined with a punt receiver and then likely a punt tight end in either the form of the guy from the Rams, Davis Allen, or Knox, who's projected for heavy ownership, is going to be the most common approach. So then the question becomes, how do you avoid that most common structure in a way that you don't sacrifice significant median or upside? And I think there's a few ways to do it. Am I cutting out, by the way?
No, you're fine.
I hope not. Okay. So the first question is, at running back, I think it's probably the most interesting position this week, because to some degree, I think wide receiver and tight end are largely determined by which quarterback you're playing or which mini correlation, if you're going to do that. I don't know that there's a ton of wide receiver plays that in isolation are huge priorities. At running back, though, given how much ownership CMC, Kamara, and Achane are going to command, and given there's a lot of pivots at running back, and now you have to understand, when you're not playing one to two of those three guys, you're going to have to swallow some median projection for sure, because Kamara's usage, CMC's projection, and then Achane in a game environment where he could easily nuke given the matchup against Las Vegas and the Dolphins team total. Those are not the most comfortable fates, right? But it's kind of one of the only ways to buy yourself a little bit of salary savings to then get up at either receiver or tight end. And so I just think it's worth pointing out that those decisions at running back are going to be really important. And luckily, I do think there are a lot of running backs who will command way less ownership, who, if you look at our sheets, project pretty darn well. Like Kyron Williams could easily do well. Breece Hall looks good. Bijan looks good. Walker, opposite the Niners, looks good. And then I think one of the hardest games to approach this week is Detroit, because Detroit is so multifaceted in how they put up fantasy points that it's really hard to predict every week how to get there. If you can get up to aim up to Sun God, you're going to be really contrarian, right? But if you just want a piece of that game, you can use either Gibbs or Demont, and either one of them, I think, could easily have a GPP winning upside. So I just think macro wise, that's going to be the approach. And then it becomes, hey, if I can pivot off of one of these running backs or two of them to the right, and I'm not saying those running backs are going to be really low owned. Like, I don't think any of the guys I just mentioned are super sneaky, but I think relative to Kamara, Achane, and CMC, they will be significantly less owned, and they can give you some savings to get up a little higher at receiver or tight end.
Yeah. Really quick before we kick it back over to John, I do want to point out that in the pivot finder, if you run the top 10 players in ownership and then you just sort it by pivot source, there are pivots off of Jahmyr Gibbs. There's pivots off of Devon Achane. There's pivots off of like the main guys here for sure. The one guy who really, I mean, Christian McCaffrey and Alvin Kamara obviously are not going to have any pivots because they're so expensive and they project so well. But like both Achane and Gibbs, who are going to get ownership, you can get off of them for Hall, for Walker, for Aaron Jones. Like you can make these pivots and it feels fine. That being said, none of Achane or Gibbs or any of these guys are bad plays. Like from a leverage perspective, they still project well. They still are fine in terms of their value. And I do think that it's fair to just land on them, but you do have to make sure that you're a little bit reticent of the stack that you're doing with. So wanted to point out that in the pivot finder, Achane and Gibbs definitely have some pivots they can use.
I hadn't really thought about how much like those running backs are dominating ownership. And I think if you just go cheaper at running back, it actually opens up a world of possibilities. Like I'm not really that sold on Alvin Kamara. Just because like the Saints offense might not be that good. They're I think they're underdogs against Cleveland in a game with a 44-point total. That doesn't necessarily scream that we should be, going out of our way to get Kamara. I think what makes him appealing from a projection standpoint is a bunch of receptions that maybe like limits him a little bit. Like if he's getting a ton of receptions, that probably means the Saints haven't scored that much in the game. Like I'd much rather go to Christian McCaffrey. But then maybe you're dropping down from Kamara to like a much cheaper running back, or a running back in the mid range. I talked up like David Montgomery, just because it seems like a kind of David Montgomery kind of game. He's the player most favored to get a touchdown on the slate. That gives you 1,700. And then I guess the flip side of Kamara and McCaffrey seeing a bunch of ownership then is like high priced wide receivers are not seeing any ownership at all.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that I necessarily want to. I don't know if I want to go spend all the way up for like Justin Jefferson or Monroe St. Brown. If I can get them, that's great. But I think the mid range of George Pickens going against the Baltimore defense gives up the most passing yards.
Yep.
And in the league, you might not see that much ownership because people are spending up instead on the running backs. So that's just a thought.
Yeah, well, and the thing about George Pickens too, I called out Pickens as an undervalued play last week. Pickens has wide receiver 1 usage since Russell Wilson took over that offense. Like he's getting as good a usage as I think like AJ Brown and Puka Nacua. Like he's getting good usage, and at 7K he's a fair play. There was somebody in the Discord who had mentioned that they were surprised that Russell Wilson didn't show up in the contest sims, and I was a bit surprised by that too. It's not like he's super expensive. Models like him a bit. It's a really, really good matchup. I think the reason why he's not showing up in contest sims is simply because he is basically not owned. Part of the things about the contest sims is that you're simulating a likely contest, and if he's not owned, then he's not going to show up as a winning player in that contest. So I think that that game with Baltimore-Pittsburgh, especially because people just refuse to accept that Russell Wilson can actually still provide wide receiver upside to anybody on his team. That's a matchup that you can absolutely take advantage of. I do think that it is worth saying though, that when the reason why these guys aren't getting ownership is because they're fucking impossible to get to. Like, I don't know how you play Justin Jefferson this week. And that's not even like me being like, oh, you're an idiot. Like, I don't know how you build a lineup that makes sense with Justin Jefferson in it. The only way that you can do it is really paying down at both quarterback and running back, at least one of the running back slots. And there's only one running back that I think that you can do that with, and the contest sims pointed him out, and that's Audric Esteem. There's so many people. I can't fucking pronounce any of these guys. But you know who I'm talking about. It's the Broncos running back that people like Davis Maddock and the other best ball bros have been hammering all year. Sean Payton came out and said that he was going to get more work, and he's 4,500, and he projects for like 11 and a half fantasy points. That's not terrible for 4,500, but he's really the only cheap running back that you can utilize that you can feel semi good about. There's nothing when you're sorting by 4X in the models and you're looking at these guys. It's like, all right, I guess I could play Ramondre Stevenson at 6,100. He's probably the cheapest that I would go, to be clear. DeAndre Swift is 6,600. I like that play more, especially at 1% owned. But then, a Stime at 4,500, he's projected for 6% ownership. I'm going to guess he gets up to around 12, 13% by the time the locks flips. Jalen Warren at 5,300. You're not playing Tyjae Spears. Like, you're probably not playing Najee Harris, even though Najee Harris probably isn't the worst play in the world in that game environment. But like, once you get below 6K, there's really nothing available. And that's why you see wide receivers that are expensive coming up basically no ownership. They're just hard to get to. Enter my concept in the contest sims idea of saying, fuck it, we're going to play a cheap quarterback with their cheap wide receiver. And then you can get to an Amon-Ra St. Brown or Justin Jefferson or a Tyreek Hill. Tyreek Hill, I think, is way too low owned for like coming back with Tua, like they get another week. That Tyreek Hill at 7,400, I understand that I have him projected relatively low. It would be stupid of me to project him super well with how that offense has done. But let's not forget that Tyreek Hill was pushing 10K last year. So if you think that he's $2,000 in a price, which very likely he could be, that's a spot to take advantage of. But that's, John, I agree with you that high wide receivers building in a way that gets you access to even one of these guys is going to be relatively contrarian, and it's going to give you a lot of relative value in GPPs.
Yeah, Jake,
hard to do.
I think that's a really good segue. One of the things I noticed very quickly this week was like, okay, how do we get value if we don't want to play the fragile, cheap chalk, Boutte or whoever else like that, right? And so I think there's a couple ways to do it. One way that I like to do it is to think, okay, can I get it through my stack? And so if you go to team stack range of outcomes and you sort by 2X, which is a way of kind of seeing relative value, right? And then you say to yourself, okay, who here has both median, ceiling, and good 2X, meaning they're good relative value, but you're not sacrificing a good floor and a good ceiling, right? Mm-hmm. And I know it's on brand for me as a bit of a Miami homer, who appropriately wore my Dolphins old school hat today.
Yeah, get to it. Yeah.
But the point is that I do agree. Like, there's, to me, like the Tua, Tyreek, Jonnu Smith combination, like there's a good amount of savings there. You get Jonnu Smith, who compared to Knox and the guy from the Rams, whatever, Davis Allen, whatever his name is, right? And on top of it, there's a little bonus, which is you have Bowers and Jacoby Myers across them, who actually both project really, really well too. And I think there's a lot worse you can do. Now, there's a few other cheaper, there's a few other stack that sort of meet that definition. You mentioned Russell Wilson there. You can do that with George Pickens. You can skinny him with George Pickens if you want. You can throw a guy in like Calvin Austin. Bo Nix you mentioned. I think if you want to get gross, you can consider Drake May. To me, it's a little bit thin. But my point here is that that's one way to do it, right? One way to do it is through your stack. If your stack has enough relative value, which then allows you to get up at your other positions. The other way to do it is to do what John was saying before, which is go a little bit more balanced and say, okay, instead of paying up for CMC and Kamara, or at least fade one of them and get down to, that mid-range or cheap running back place. And then that allows you to get some money to get up at tight end or wide receiver. I think the last way to do it, and I know this is like an area that has generated a little bit of controversy because people really anchor on their priors, and James, I know like what side of the fence you sit on. I don't know really what side of the fence Squirrel's on. He's smart. So John, you probably feel like it's Slate specific, is you can consider double tight end. Like, I don't know why people wouldn't think that the relative value of the cheaper tight ends is just as good as the guy from the Patriots. I mean, to me, it's relative to the pricing on the slate. I understand the argument against it, which is that typically tight ends don't have the GPP upside to win you a GPP. But I think in this context, we're talking about relative value and how do you find some so you can get up at wide receiver or at running back, right? And I think you could do worse. There is a decent amount of tight end value this week, and I think you could do worse than playing some of the chalkier wide receivers who, from a relative value standpoint, project pretty similarly to those guys.
Yeah, John, what do you set on double tight end?
So yeah, one thing with double tight end, like if you're doing double tight end, then like by definition, you're not doing you're passing on one of Kamara, CMC, or Achane. Yeah, I don't know. I kind of I think I like.
You sound anti. Yeah.
I don't mind it. It's just it is. It's like Slate specific. I don't know how much upside these guys have, like the $2,500 guys. I guess like if I'm going double tight end, like I'm probably going double cheap tight end and trying to like then spend up at 2 running backs and spend up at a wide receiver, or play Lamar or whatever. It'll be lineup specific. I'll have some lineups that have double tight end that I don't know if I should, because it does like it kind of limits the upside. Like the chances are these tight ends aren't going nuts. Like the cheap wide receivers can go berserk. Like Matt Collins or whatever. I can just be running down the field. It's like, oh well, he's only 3,500 on DraftKings, or Curtis Samuel, I guess, maybe less likely. But yeah, some of these guys, right, can go berserk. Like I don't see the cheap tight ends like going nuts.
Yeah. I ran I ran the pivot finder for Keyshawn Boot just because we're talking about this, right? Like, does he have as much upside as tight ends, right?
I feel like we should have looked up how to pronounce his name before we started.
No, you know what? It's fucking character, all right? It just adds flavor.
In the comments, Ike says it's Butte for the record.
Yeah. Butte and Estime. But I will say that every time that I mispronounce a name, it's the shake of a salt shaker on top of a steak. All right. You can't have a steak without flavor. So Keyshawn Butte, he has a projection of 8.63. Okay. It's pretty low. There are clearly a lot of pivots. I ran wide receivers and tight ends just for the sake of this conversation. But when you look at ceilings, like their one standard deviation ceiling for all of these guys is low. And I think that what it comes down to is if you are forced to use a $3,500 player, if you are forced to use somebody under 4K, yes, you can use a double tight end, right? Like if your build necessitates it, basically. But I'm not sold on this slate specifically being that I am forced to use one of these guys that I just ran the pivot finder on. If it comes down to it and I'm running optimal Sunday morning and I'm like, man, I am super fucked. I have to have somebody who is under 4K in the flex. What am I going to do about this? Then I'm going to run the pivot finder. I'm going to say, well, I'll probably play Calvin Austin, who is projected for 3% ownership and has the highest ceiling in the bunch, and just call it a day. I'm not going to play Keyshawn Butte. But I think that I would very likely at the same time say, how can I possibly mitigate this to where I am not making this decision because it feels awful? And all of these guys have a ceiling that is less than 20 within one standard deviation. Now, granted, somebody like Calvin Austin or Matt Collins or Khalif Raymond or even Nick Westbrook-Akine, which I probably pronounced that wrong too, whatever. Like any of these guys, they run deep enough routes, and some of them, Westbrook-Akine has touchdown equity, right? Like he has caught some touchdowns in recent weeks. So these guys, you could use them. They have 15 plus fantasy point upside, but I think you just have to ask yourself, is this a slate where having somebody who scored less than 20 fantasy points is going to be in the winning GPP lineup? And I'm not convinced that that's true, mostly because I can get a cheap quarterback and I can get a cheap defense, and there's enough mid-range that I feel like I still have upside. It's just tearing a page out of Blender's book. Blender refuses to play a wide receiver under 4,500 in GBPs. He just won't do it. He will get off them in cash, which I think is silly, but like he hates playing them. And I think that this slate, certainly, I don't necessarily think that I am wrong to say that I do not want to play these guys.
Let me ask you guys. Go ahead, John.
So just a thing on the Patriots wide receivers. Like one thing I said on my Friday show that I might do is just set the projections for like Kayshon Boutte, like KJ Osborne, this Jalen Polk. Like all these, like the Patriots have a bunch of like 3K-ish wide receivers. I mean, 3,500-ish wide receivers. And we think because Boutte has been playing like the most snaps the last few weeks, like he's projecting the best. But that, like if KJ Osborne gets like an 80-yard touchdown, it doesn't really matter. So like if you just play KJ Osborne instead, like that's your pivot. Like, you know, and that it's probably like direct leverage off of Boutte. So is DeMario Douglas or whoever, Jalen Polk. All these guys are super cheap. There's probably only going to be one at most that catches a touchdown. There's no real reason to think it's going to be Boutte. You know, and so if you really want to play a chalk lineup that just differentiates, like that's something you could do.
Let me ask you guys a question, and I don't want to over focus on the three running backs, but I do think again they're pretty critical to how you're going to build. Yeah. So I'm going to give you like the one line pro and con for each guy. Okay, CMC pro is high total, should be rounding into form in the near future, and you know usage, right? Plus historical outcomes that are supported, right? Supportive of GPP winning upside. Kamara, mostly usage. I think the best argument for him is usage. I mean, like they lost Olave, they lost Shaheed. Like even in a game where last week, like he was a drop pass away from hitting his like all his bonuses and a touchdown. And I sort of like half trolled because I scarily faded him and it worked out for me. But like, admittedly, I probably shouldn't have. And it was like anyway, I don't want to revisit the past, but it was a stupid, like, it was like a stupid celebration on my part because like, honestly, I just got lucky when he didn't catch that pass and didn't score and everybody would have gotten there. And I probably would have lost all my cash lineups where I didn't even play him. But anyway, the point is usage is the main argument for him. And then Achane, it's like, it's priced for him. Like he's a lot cheaper than those two guys. High total, really high efficiency and good matchup. Right. So, and then the cons are for CMC is, Kittle's questionable. I think he's like legitimately questionable from what I know. But they still have Debo. They still have Jennings back. So, you know, and this is still his second game back. Like, you know, he didn't look like prime CMC last week. He looked fine, but he wasn't like unbelievable, right? So the argument is he's still rounding into form and they still have some other options. Kamara, the arguments against it are, you know, I don't think the Browns have been incredible this year on defense, but as you mentioned, John, like fairly low total game. And like, you know, if they just focus on closing him down, the Saints don't have a lot of other options. And then Achane, I think the argument against him is mostly that he's often gotten there on efficiency, like in the sense that he'll break like a 50 or 60 or 80 yard run, and he doesn't always get that much volume. I think that's mitigated by his price significantly because he's a lot cheaper. But I guess my question for you guys is, John, you already sort of said that I think you would be most willing to fade Alvin of those three. James, how do you feel about that? And do you think I'm oversimplifying it? I think those kind of knowing where you stand on those three guys and then being willing to go to one of the cheaper running backs off of at least one, if not two of those guys is going to get you to a very different lineup build than a lot of the field, at least in the stuff I play, which is smaller single entry 3 max.
Yeah, it depends on what happens tomorrow. I don't know. I'll run optimals and we'll see where I stand, but I can't really see myself getting into Kamara or CMC. I get it. I know why people are doing it, but people are doing it and forcing in these shitty wide receivers that are not good and don't project well. And I just think that very, very, very likely I can find lineups that project within like 2, at most 3 fantasy points of Alvin Kamara and Christian McCaffrey lineups without using them. Just simply because the cheap wide receivers, the Butte and Elijah Moore and these guys, like they only project for 8-9 fantasy points at most. So I can find people in the mid range. I can find Jameson Williams. I can find Ricky Pearsall. I can find other wide receivers who are in this 5 to 6K range, and I can just get those guys who actually project well, or at least decently, drop down $1,000 to somebody, Kenneth Walker or Ramondre Stevenson or, Dave Montgomery, some of these guys, and drop down from them. And then I can have lineups that I think have a better realistic ceiling. To the point of like, if Alvin Kamara gets there, which getting there for Alvin Kamara at 8,200, it's one thing at 8,200 if Alvin Kamara puts up 20 fantasy points and he's accessible. It's a completely different thing on a slate like this, where if he puts up 25 fantasy points, but the only way to get there was to use these cheap wide receivers, and every cheap wide receiver only puts up like 7 and 10 fantasy points, it's likely that Alvin Kamara is not in the winning lineups because he's just too expensive. And if you have instead lineups where you used Ramondre Stevenson and Devon Kane, and then you can also now get to Jacoby Myers as a pay up over, or as a value over Elijah Moore, that $1,300 starts to matter a lot. It's just magnified on slates like this. So I think that it's less likely that I get up to those guys. And all of that said, contest sims, Christian McCaffrey is a negative edge as is. And that's at 19% ownership. I think he comes in at 30-something% ownership. So I think that when I'm looking at these guys, like if I'm gonna play one of them, it'd probably be Alvin Kamara, but it's way more likely I don't play either. I think that I'd much rather just focus on the mid-range. I think there's a lot of running backs that are in good spots this week, and I don't even think that I have to force in any extra relative value or direct leverage against these high-priced guys, just because I think I can build better lineups in the mid-range.
Would you, if you're fading in your lineups, if you're building more than a few lineups, or even if you are only hand building a few lineups, would you focus on what it means for CMC not to get there? Meaning, would you try a little harder to get Debo in, or Pearsall, or Jennings with Purdy, or even without Purdy, since you're not playing CMC, given how chalky he's going to be? Or would you? I mean, because what that means, if CMC doesn't get there, right? What it means is one of two things: either he gets there in a sense that you just pointed out, meaning he did fine, but you sacrificed so much based off his price that it didn't help you. Or it means that he doesn't even get there all the way, and Debo got there, right? Or one of the other guys got there. So John, would you be like trying a little harder if you're fading a CMC to play a little more Debo?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I'm much stronger on McCaffrey, I think, than Kamara. I think we should keep in mind, like, McCaffrey is actually fresh, which is weird. I mean, it's week 11, and he's only played one game, whereas Kamara is like wearing down. Kamara's been playing every game through like a bunch of injuries, and the Saints still, like, all of their backup running backs have been injured, so he can't really get a spell. I don't know. I'm just stunned that McCaffrey is like projecting around the same level as Kamara. So like I'm going to go like much heavier, I think, on McCaffrey than Kamara. If I'm not playing McCaffrey, like, do I go to Debo, or I guess I'd be more likely to play like Debo or Javon Jennings. I'll definitely like make a point of having some Brock Purdy lineups that don't have McCaffrey but have like Debo and Javon Jennings, because that's like just a thing that can happen, right? Like, those guys get the touchdowns. Maybe San Francisco's even just blowing them out, and they don't need McCaffrey on the field. They want to rest him or whatever. So that's a possibility. I just think McCaffrey's in a much stronger situation.
Yeah, I lean with that former point, Pablo, that it's not even really for me about like fading Christian McCaffrey. It's fading the cheap players that you have to use to get Christian McCaffrey. If Christian McCaffrey scores 25 fantasy points, I think that's likely what he is going to do. The question is Christian McCaffrey plus Elijah Moore if that scores 35 and 25 of it comes from Christian McCaffrey, I think that I can get better by using Devon Achane and getting his 25 fantasy points and then pairing that with Jacoby Myers in a correlative bringback who I also think can get 25 fantasy points. I just think that there's more upside in utilizing these mid-range options rather than the cheap ones. And that's really what it is. It's not fading the expensive guys. It's fading the cheap guys that you have to use to get to the expensive guys.
Yeah. Let me ask you guys about 2 or 3 games. So I think we're going to see a decent amount of ownership on San Francisco, Seattle for mostly because Purdy and CMC people, and then I do think Seattle has like a handful of decent bringbacks in the form of Metcalf, who's back, JSN, Walker, who I think will be a little scary to play given their dogs against the Niners. And then if you really want to punt, you can, that guy Barner is a punt tight end. I don't think he's any less shaky than Butte, but at least you're getting savings and you're not playing one of the other chalky punt tight ends. But my point being that game's going to get ownership. Obviously, we're going to have some ownership on Jameis in the form of Jameis himself and doubles with him and Camara bringbacks. I think there's a few games that may, because of those things, may go a little bit overlooked, right? And so the two that there's 2 or 3 that stick out to me. One is Baltimore, Pittsburgh. You've talked a little bit about Russell Wilson being, the narrative being that he's like not a great quarterback. And the point being that Pickens has had significant sort of alpha usage over the last several weeks with him. Lamar, unfortunately, is so pricey that while he has like incredible ceiling, we're already struggling to fit even the mid-range quarterback. So it's going to be really hard to build up with Lamar. Although, admittedly, if you can make it work in a way that you're happy with, I think you're going to really differentiate yourself with him. But then the other games that the one that really sticks out to me is, Buffalo KC has a 46-point total. Legitimate sort of GPP upside players on both sides of that game. And I don't know that it's going to get a ton of ownership because individually, I don't know that any of the guys outside of maybe like Travis Kelce or DeAndre Hopkins are going to command that much ownership. I would say that, and then the game that's a little more gross, and the total admittedly is a little lower with the total of 44, is the Broncos Falcons. I'm not quite as excited about that game. Can't tell you really exactly why. Maybe it's because I don't know. I think I'm just more likely to play one-offs from that game and like the form of Bijan or maybe one of the receivers. But do you guys have any thoughts on some of these games that may go a little bit overlooked? And I'm not saying we should force old school sort of traditional, builds with like you mentioned at the beginning, James. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that sometimes that game with the 3rd or 4th highest total, in this case, Buffalo KC, and we see this in every sport. We see this in baseball quite a bit. Goes overlooked for spots where there's easier chalk that brings other chalk with it. And as a result of that, there's just like numerous valuable pieces in those games that go overlooked. And to me, Buffalo KC kind of fits that mold a little bit, but I don't know. I'm curious to get your guys' thoughts on that.
I think Baltimore or Pittsburgh is my favorite game environment of the week. Like if I'm making one lineup, it's probably Russell Wilson, and it's probably got like, George Pickens and then maybe Rashad Bateman, Mark Gain. I want to play pieces of this game. Like Baltimore has allowed the most passing whatever's you want to look at, touchdowns, receiving yards, like anything, just Baltimore. And they're still winning games doing that. So like they're not going to like start changing their like defensive philosophy. They're going to start mixing things up now. And yeah, Russell Wilson has like the Russell Wilson effect where people don't want to click on his name no matter what the matchup. It stuns me that like Russell Wilson and George Pickens, like I thought they'd be the highest owned quarterback and wide receiver on the slate until I started looking at ownership projections. So like that's one place I'll go. Like I think Kansas City and Buffalo is interesting. I think we'll see like pretty high ownership on Khalil Shakir. I haven't seen how things have updated, but just because I guess especially if Amari Cooper's out, I think he's still questionable. but with Kincaid out, then I think we'll be in the same situation that we were in last week, and Shakir will end up seeing a lot of ownership. It's just like Kansas City's got a much better defense than people usually recognize. Like their Kansas City games seem like they always have high totals, and it seems like they never do.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'd probably lean towards like Baltimore, Pittsburgh. I would definitely. It's in the Kansas City Buffalo game is also a difficult game to stack. Like, do you go like with Mahomes, who never seems to get you like pay off his price tag? You go with Josh Allen, who's the second most expensive quarterback. I could see maybe I'm playing like Shakir and running it back to some Kansas City player. And, having a game stack of another game maybe, and then you've got Khalil Shakir and Travis Kelce. It's going to be a very different like build potentially, but like maybe that's a way of playing that game for a way that could like easily turn out.
I think that Detroit is too low owned as a stack. They have a 31 implied total against a team that I've been attacking for, I don't know, the better part of the season, Jacksonville. I don't think that they can cover a chair with Tarp. They're just awful. In the same way that the Ravens give up like everything to wide receivers and passing yards, like Jacksonville is not far behind. They're bottom three, and I would argue like just as good of a matchup for wide receiver ones. Like Baltimore gives it up to everyone, but Jacksonville, they've gotten shredded by every wide receiver one they've looked at. And yeah, Detroit is a little bit expensive, but when you sort the team stacks by team total, and you see that Detroit is coming in with ownerships that are, sums of less than 25. I mean, the Jameson Williams, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jared Goff one, that one has the highest sum ownership for that stack at 31, and I'll take the under on that. I think that people aren't going to be able to afford it. So, like, I think that ignoring the highest total on the slate is typically a mistake that people make, especially because they think that it's kitschy to go with a lower team total. I mean, people would be more willing to play, I don't know, with like where is ownership on some of these cheaper stacks? People are happy to play Bo Nix, 28% some ownership
like
here.
Bo Nix.
People are happy to play Cleveland stacks. This has as much ownership as a Detroit stack, and their team total is literally 10 points less. I mean, sure, price has something to do with it, but when you're seeing that low ownership, and I think it will come in lower than this, I think that represents a nice opportunity. And especially because you can leverage Jahmyr Gibbs with it. And that brings back what you had mentioned about Christian McCaffrey earlier, where do you want to leverage him in case just because if he doesn't get there, then there's a reason why, and that is because of the passing game or Deebo Samuel or whatever. I think that is less important to do with Christian McCaffrey than it is with Jahmyr Gibbs, because Jahmyr Gibbs is more accessible. He's 7,200 rather than 8,300. So I think that Detroit makes for a really, really good stack. San Francisco a little bit less so because people are going to be on it. But I agree that Pittsburgh is really interesting. I think Pittsburgh is a great stack. I do actually think that Miami, Pablo, to your point, Tua plus Tyreek plus Jonnu Smith you can do that. You can do that and make it work. And it's leverage off of a Kane, which I really like having. And you have a bring back of Jacoby Myers in that mid-range, which I really, really like. So there's a lot of things that I like about Miami stacks, and with team total 26.25, that's a little bit old. I think it's a little bit lower than that, but I think you can make it work. 17.2K for a Miami stack in a matchup that I think that they can really do a lot of work. That's a spot that I have a lot of interest in.
Yeah, James, to your point on Detroit, I think just to go back on that for a minute, when I started looking at the slate in detail yesterday and a little more today, I said, man, what am I going to do about Detroit? Because their total is by far the highest, but Amon-Ra is so expensive that we've talked about it. Like, it's already hard to fit him, even if you're not using Jared Goff, who's not that cheap. And so the most common approach to Detroit is going to be for people to say, I'm just going to use Gibbs or Demont by themselves. And that's my way of getting a piece of that game, right? People are going to say, like, I need some Detroit, so I'm going to use Demont or Gibbs. And by the way, I don't know that that's crazy. Like, I think those are both fine plays. But to your point, I do think that relative to their total and their upside, stacking Goff is going to be incredibly low owned, and there's a decent chance after the slate people are like, holy shit, like why didn't I have one stack at least of the highest team total when like none of these guys are owned, right? And I think it's one of those things that's obvious, but you don't do it because it's kind of uncomfortable to do because it forces such a different build structure than you would normally do.
I like the idea of being over the field on trade. I think it's weird when we have these weeks where like the highest implied point total team like doesn't see ownership because like the team's like supposed to score the most points on the week. Like, and I think there's like even betting odds out there on like the team to score the most points on Sunday or whatever. It's going to be the Lions that are the team. It's like the NBA thing where people don't want to play the team because it could be a blowout. But if it's a blowout, like the team had to score a bunch of touchdowns.
They got there.
Yeah. So yeah, I think Detroit will be underowned. And yeah, they're gonna like probably put up like 35 points. People are gonna be going wide. But it was gonna be a blowout. I actually really like Jameson Williams. Just because he's a wide receiver and gets there on one play. And so like Detroit might not have a ton of volume. Right. So I think it's more of a Jameson Williams week than a Amon-Ra St. Brown week, which is convenient because it gives us a bunch of savings. Because like Amon-Ra is a guy who's gonna get a bunch of receptions. And he'll have multi-touchdown games at some point. But like that's almost like baked into his price. Like Amon-Ra gets there when like Detroit's down or it's very competitive and so they gotta pass the ball. Jameson Williams, it can be 14-0 Detroit and he just takes it 80 yards to the house and gets his touchdown. And pays off his price tag. So yeah, I like the idea of being over the field on Detroit. I don't think it's like something I'd necessarily go a lot to in like smaller field stuff because like it might not project that well. But like for larger field stuff, like if you're trying to like win the Million Maker or something, like you should be over the field on Detroit, I think.
Yeah, I wrote up Jameson Williams.
Yeah.
I wrote up Jameson Williams. I think he's a great play. And models have kind of been a little bit lower on Amon-Ra St. Brown this year, just because they haven't needed to be high. His usage is good, but to your point, they mostly use him when they actually need to be competitive in a game, and they've just been blowing teams out left and right. So the low volume guy of Jameson Williams, I think is a much better play. And in that game environment, like Mac Jones, I don't think that Mac Jones is a great quarterback, but I do think that like Brian Thomas Jr. is going to be 2% owned. Gabe Davis is going to be nothing owned. Evan Ingram, who I think he had like 8 targets last week or more. Had a whole lot of targets went to tight ends for Jacksonville last week. Evan Ingram's not going to be owned at all. So there's a lot of kind of nice game environment there where if people are saying that it's a blowout, that's fine. That means that Detroit scored a shit ton of points. But also, where's the second part of that where people always say, oh, well, it's a game script where they're going to need to pass from behind. Like, where are the people on that? Nobody's on that. So that I think that people are just undervaluing that game environment.
Yeah, going back to the JMO call out. The other question I asked myself this week, because I think quarterback to some degree is dictated a little bit by, do you like the stack partners and to some degree pricing related with what you want to fit in your skill positions. Running back, we talked a lot about is sort of the big 3 ownership guys, and then how are you pivoting? If you're pivoting, how many of them you're pivoting off of? Wide receiver, I guess my question for you guys is, how looking through the wide receiver list, right? You've got like Jeff and Amon-Ra at the very top, right? You've got Tyreek, who's not going to be that owned, who I think is egregiously underowned, given that game environment and his historical upside, and the fact that Miami's like slowly starting to round into form with another get right game against Las Vegas. Kupp and Puka not going to be very owned, and then you enter this land between like 7K and call it 5K, right? Which is the mid-range receivers. And I guess my question for both of you is, how much are you letting your quarterback decision or your like a mini correlation dictate which of those guys between 5 to 7Ks? Because I don't have a huge player pool this week. Like my 5 to 7K player pool is literally like 30 guys. Like it's not much. And so my question is, how much do you guys feel like there's in isolation really good plays that you really want to get to, versus letting your quarterback or your game, to some degree, your mini correlation or more than your mini correlation dictate who you go to? Do you guys feel like you have individual players you really want in that range, or do you feel like you're going to let your sort of macro lineup build in some correlation dictate? Because I'm leaning towards the latter, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there are some players in that range that really should be just saying, hey, I really want to get this guy.
I think there's a bunch of good players. Sorry, like in that range, like in the 5 to 7 for wide receivers. Like, yeah, I mean, I think the guy at the top of the list. Hold on, yeah, George Pickens is 7,000. I mean, I don't know. He's has some of the. I think he's got one of the higher yards per catch marks this season.
Yep.
Same as last season, and he's going up against the defense to give up the most yards per catch, or one of the most yards per catch in the NFL. Like, why would we not? But like, I think that's a guy you should prioritize. Yeah, I think going like much cheaper, like Cortland Sutton, same thing. Like Atlanta gives up passing yards. Jameson Williams, 5,800. Like that's a guy. These are guys I want to prioritize, even if I'm not playing that game environment necessarily. Like Calvin Ridley been going absolutely berserk. There's a good chance Minnesota just says like we're going to let him do his thing because like the rest of Tennessee isn't going to score on us. And they should probably be able to score on Tennessee. So yeah, I don't know. I think there's a bunch of receivers in this range that I want to get to, which I do. I think that's going to give me like different builds than a lot of the field, just because like a lot of the field is going up to that, that 3 running back build that then leaves you having to use just like value receivers.
Yeah, my big,
that's why I brought it up, because I think these guys are going to be pretty key, honestly.
Yeah, my big thing is this range, actually. I think that living in this range makes a lot of sense. Cortland Sutton, I think, makes a lot of sense against Atlanta. And to your larger point, I do kind of want to focus a little bit more on the correlation between these guys and my quarterback. I think that Bo Nix plus Cortland Sutton makes sense. I think it will be popular, which sucks, but I think that it makes a lot of sense. I think that utilizing somebody like George Pickens with Russell Wilson, I think makes a lot of sense. I think utilizing, Jalen Waddle with Tua, right? Even that makes sense. Jalen Waddle's only 5,900. We've seen Jalen Waddle have really, really good games with Tua. He's put up 30 plus fantasy points before. 5,900, I think he's undervalued. DeAndre Hopkins at 5,700. He was basically the same price last week and ended up like 30% owned. And this is a way better game environment. And now he's 10% owned for reasons that are beyond me. I think Hopkins is a really good spot at 5,700. Jacoby Myers, I think that playing him with a Miami stack, even a secondary correlation with Devon Kane, I can see myself kind of like starting with that as a build. That makes sense. There's a lot of guys that I think are really good here. The ones that the part of it that I think is the most interesting is that look at the ownerships. They're all low. There's nobody really here except for Jacoby Myers and Khalil Shakur, and Deebo Samuel to an extent that are projecting for any ownership whatsoever. Like all these guys are going to be low owned. So I think that you could even go as far as to say that if you pair, 2 or 3 of these guys together, you can kind of do whatever else you want with your lineup from a relative value standpoint and from a leverage standpoint. So this is where I want to live. I think this is the key to the slate, is this range. And it makes it easier that pairing a lot of these guys with their quarterback is not necessarily all that difficult. Jameson Williams with Jared Goff. Jared Goff is relatively cheap. I think that combo makes sense. Cortland Sutton plus Bo Nix makes sense. Tua plus Jalen Waddle makes sense. So going back to what I said at the beginning of this, where I am into the idea of QB plus ones this week, I think that this range makes that work really, really well. With Detroit, Jared Goff, we play Jared Goff so that he can have 300 yards and 3 touchdowns, right? If 120 of those yards and 2 of those touchdowns goes to Jameson Williams and then the rest just goes to guys, I don't necessarily need to have the second part of that stack if I have Jameson Williams, who got the vast majority of it at 5,800. I don't feel as inclined to have Amon-Ra St. Brown plus Jameson Williams or Brock Wright. Since there's no Sam Laporta, you could do that QB +2, but Brock Wright has that same ceiling of like 13 fantasy points or whatever, and I don't feel that you need to do that. I don't think you need to eat that. So I think that there are a lot in this range. This is where I think you should live. I think that Millie Maker lineups are going to be one using a combination of 2 or 3 guys from this range, and I feel pretty strongly about that.
You mentioned tight end there, and it's the one position we sort of glossed over that I just want to bring up again. I want to get your guys' take on something that I've heard debated a few times across some of the popular pods in the industry, which is I've heard 2 takes on the chalky cheap tight ends. And we've had that few weeks like this. Like we had one week, James, where you were very vocal on the guy from Green Bay.
We don't have to talk about Tucker Kraft week. We can just continue.
No, it's just an example, right? But my greater point here is that I've heard 2 arguments. One argument I've heard, and it's actually not a good example, that example, for what it's worth. What the question I'm asking is, how willing are you to play the cheap / punt tight end who's really chalky as a way of getting your value savings uncorrelated? And here's the arguments for and against I've heard for that. The arguments for that I've heard are that tight end, especially this year so far, although I do believe this has changed the last few weeks where we've started to have like slate breaking upside in some of the pay up tight ends. But the argument I've heard for being okay with that has been tight end is a position where your opportunity cost is low enough where if you've already got enough leverage in the rest of your lineup, why make yourself even more volatile with a tight end who projects well and is cheap value, right? The argument I've heard against it has been if it's a position where you can get somebody at the same price or near the same price who may have a slightly different median, but doesn't have a very different ceiling and may even have a better ceiling at a much lower ownership, why would you not want that as one of your leverage points? And so what I'm asking you guys is, where do you sit on that side of the fence? Because I do think it's relevant this week because we're going to have Knox and Davis Allen as 2 really chalky tight ends that people are going to play as one-offs. And I'm wondering if you guys are likely to be under, equal to, or over the field on that based off sort of the game theory philosophy that you subscribe to there.
Yeah, I'll let you go first on that, John. I can kind of guess where you stand, but I definitely know where I stand. And I'm just interested to hear what you say.
Just be like, am I going to be over the field on Knox and Allen? Or?
Well, more how you look at, with the chalky tight ends. I mean, are you inclined more to look at that just from a roster construction standpoint? Are you more inclined to eat ownership on a chalky tight end as a one-off, or try to find a way away from them?
It's hard to say. I want to say that I'm going to be under the field on Knox and Allen. Or a chalky tight end. The realistic thing is it's probably not as important of a question. Like we probably don't need to agonize about it, right? It probably depends more on the rest of my lineup. If I'm playing a much different rest of my lineup, then I'm okay with the idea that I'm gonna stick Dawson Knox in there. Like he'll probably get some points. Or Davis Allen. If I'm like, I don't want to be playing kind of the same lineups as everybody else, if that makes sense. So if I'm playing like Jameis Winston, I'm going to be much less likely to play like Davis Allen, I think, than if I'm playing like Lamar Jackson. If I'm playing Lamar Jackson, I may need to play Davis Allen. If I'm playing Josh Allen, I might have to play Davis Allen, or just because like I need the savings somewhere, and maybe no tight end does something. Right. So, I don't know. That's how I feel on it.
I mostly think that this week, with what I think will probably be 15% owned or so, Davis Allen and Dawson Knox. Maybe Dawson Knox gets a lot more ownership than that. I'm not sure. I don't think that either one of these guys are going to be so much ownership that it forces an issue. I agree with you on that, John. But from a macro concept perspective, because I build 3 to 5 lineups, right? Like I don't MME, I play the higher dollar and just build a couple lineups. But for me, if I'm building a couple lineups and I am looking at my lineup and I say, all right, I have a really popular combination of running backs and I have a super popular, cheap wide receiver and my stack is middling, like I'm much more likely to try to find a way to get away from these guys. Whereas if I have, a low owned stack, if I stack Drake May plus Demario Douglas as my base stack, like I have no reason to get away from Dawson Knox or Davis Allen. I just don't. It doesn't offer me anything more. I don't gain anything there. And I'm not trying to win by a whole bunch of points. That's the mistake that people make. When you have low ownership, it gives you an opportunity to pass more of the field. That's the function of ownership itself. So when I already have low-ish ownership, if I'm looking at an ownership that has like 90-ish% some ownership, I don't need to get lower than that. I'm fine with then also having Davis Allen or Dawson Knox. And once you get into some ownership of like 75%, you start being like, if I don't enter this in the Millie Maker, I should not play this because it's got too much relative value and you don't need to win by 30 fucking points in the Wildcat. You should try to win by 10-ish or whatever. Otherwise, you should have probably played in the bigger field. So really quick, I did want to note, because we've gotten a couple questions in the chat. I will answer questions specifically as you guys have been asking them once we're kind of done with the slate analysis. I'm not ignoring anyone. I see them. But I just wanted to let you know that I will hit those. So like questions on how I'm picking stacks or like what does fade the public mean in the NFL and sports betting? Like we'll answer some of those questions towards the end.
So James, maybe that's a good a time here for us to sort of, we've been going for about an hour.
Yeah.
So maybe just some high level thoughts on where you guys think the highest edge on the slate are. We've hit on a lot of them. And then we can get to some questions. And then also anything you guys think we're overlooking that is critical to this slate. I think we've covered some of the critical points. I mean, from my standpoint, I think it becomes, number one, where do you get your value from? Are you going to do it through your stack or are you going to do it through not your stack? Like, are you going to do it through a quarterback and a wide receiver tight end that you're getting some savings on, like a Tua Jonnu Smith or a Bo Nix? Or are you doing it through fading CMC Kamara to some of the cheaper running backs? We made the point that there's some really good pivots at running back. And I don't know, on a slate where we're starved for value, that you should feel so scared to fade those guys. John, I kind of side with you on CMC. Like, I think there's a lot of reasons to be bullish on him, especially in this game. And just the fact that he's like 2 weeks in, he's super fresh. To me, he's pretty scary to fade. I'm also like a little afraid to fade Achane, I have to say, because his price is so cheap. But I don't feel that bad about it because I think you can build with those two guys and still get plenty of leverage across the field. I think Kamara is a little easier to fade. But the greater point being here that I think if you go a little cheaper at running back, you're going to give yourself some savings. And then the other point we made has been that there are some sneakier spots in the form of that Baltimore-Pittsburgh game. Russ stacks look to be wildly underowned. And then the other thing is Detroit. Detroit has a super high total. I don't think it's crazy just to get a piece of them via Gibbs, Demont, or JMO in isolation if you're playing smaller field. But I also think for larger field, you should be maybe consciously trying to ask yourself, like, do you want to have some Detroit stacks given their total and how low owned they're going to be? Those are kind of the high level points we've hit. What do you guys think in terms of any like big picture, either macro, micro edge that we can generate on a slate like this one? We have really tight pricing and some pretty concentrated chalk.
I just think like if there's one point I think that I'm taking away from the week, I think that we're gonna see some concentrated chalk. I think it's like gonna be around Jameis Winston and Kayshon Boutte and and Alvin Kamara. Like these are three players I'm just not that high on. Like so I'm probably gonna be getting far away from the chalk. And I think like the idea that we're sitting here saying like, well, yeah, there's these really low game environments that have really high totals and could be shootouts. Like, well, why would we not just play those game environments? And we can like some of this chalk is very thin, like the Keyshawn Butte. I'm saying, like, you can just flip his projection with any of the other cheaper Patriots wide receivers. And, whether you're doing one lineup or 150, like, just flip their projections. And then, or, do that, with the $2,500 tight ends or whatever. Is Davis Allen that much better than, like, Charlie Kohler or whatever? Just, like, some of this chalk is very thin. So I think just getting away from that chalk and then you can play these higher total game environments.
Yeah, my main thing that I took away from this is that I should probably play Miami. Unfortunately, I have been sold on a Miami stack. It makes a lot of sense.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, you did this to me, John. It sounds like you agree.
Yeah, no, like if you could play like a Tua, Christian McCaffrey, Tyreek Hill, Devin Achane lineup, it would have looked absurd at the beginning of the season. Like week 1, before we knew McCaffrey was going to miss Monday night or whatever. Like if you had said, like, yeah, I'm playing this lineup, but how are you getting like Tyreek Hill and Christian McCaffrey and Devin Achane all in the same? Like that's crazy, Like, well, no, it's actually very doable this week because these guys' prices are way, like, we're sitting here saying like, oh, it's such a tight week for pricing. That's just like kind of due to the projections that we're looking at. If you just think about historically, like, well, what if all these guys are actually healthy and able to go do the things they've been doing the whole rest of the time they've been playing football? That's a very good lineup.
Yeah. I think.
Yeah, I'm usually very anti sort of like if you're a fan of the team, any sort of take, but there's once in a while I think that if you actually follow a team closely, you have a little bit of edge that can be generated in the right light. And I will tell you, as someone who sadly follows the Miami Dolphins really closely, there's also some like very clear narrative reasons why what you guys are saying makes sense. Tua was gone for 5 games, right? He came back 2 games ago. They looked like appropriately a little rusty. Last week, they started to look a little better. The game was kind of a gross game against LA, but they were sort of starting to get back in sync. That offense is super timing based. It's that McVay, Shanahan, lots of guys in motion all the time. It's like one tick off and it doesn't work, right? Last year, they were on a run for like 10 weeks straight of slate breaking, where every week we were like, you have to figure out a way to play Tyreek Hill. To your point, James, like being 10K, Achane. Now we're like, everybody has sort of like decided that they're just still rusty / terrible because Tua got hurt, that they're not under. Plus, you've got a matchup against Las Vegas, which is not scary, and a high team total. So there's just and they're not even that owned. And you get savings in Jonnu Smith. So I feel very strongly. I like it when these things line up because it means I get to cheer for my team. But I agree with you guys for those reasons.
Yeah, I'm glad that I got you to talk a little bit more about Miami. I
waited until the very end.
They're a really good stack this week. I think the reason why they're a good stack is because they're accessible but not overly so. They project well, but not so well that people are going to be forcing them in. I think that they're a strong stack. The other stacks that I think I came away from this with are Pittsburgh. Thank you, John. We're going to be on that. And it makes sense because the matchup is terrific. And then also Detroit. I just think that Detroit is too low owned, and you can do Jared Goff plus James Williams as a QB +1, and I think that it makes sense. Or you can add in Brock Wright, who is nice and cheap, and I think adds to that correlation if you really do want to do QB +2. The overall thing for this slate that I think makes sense is you really should try to live in that mid-range of wide receivers. I think that's the money spot this week. I think trying to avoid lineups where you feel like you have been forced into playing one of these punt wide receivers is going to be significantly more profitable this week and most weeks, frankly. So that's kind of the way that I'm going to be looking at this slate overall. And I think that you can do. I don't think that you need to get away from all of the chalk to do that either. I think you can still build in a way that takes advantage of Gibbs and Achane and some of these mid-range wide receivers, Jacoby Myers, who's going to have ownership. I think you can have Jacoby Myers and it makes sense. So That's kind of the way that I'm looking at it. I think you can still eat the chalk, but I think you should live in that mid-range wide receivers. Now that we have gotten through all that, if there are questions, and I'll answer a couple as we go through the comments, but if anybody is still here that wants to ask some questions, either me or Miami Superfan over here or Squirrel Patrol, then certainly, we can do that. We can answer some questions for a little while, probably, 10 minutes or whatever. But one of the first questions to come in, let's see. When using the Sims, are you focusing more on exposure or edge? So I'll pull up the Sims again here really quick so that we can just kind of answer.
Hey James, while you do that, let me do one thing real quick. While you're putting it up.
Okay.
A lot of you guys are probably listening for the first time because we've got Squirrel Patrol, aka Squirrel Master, joining us as a guest this week. Hopefully, we'll convince him to join us a little bit more moving forward. But for those of you who aren't familiar with the tools, James is about to show some of the tools. I do strongly believe, as somebody who has used most of the tools across the industry, that the tools of Paydirt offer significant edge at a ridiculously good value. So I encourage people, even if it's for a day pass or a week, to check them out because they make it really easy to understand where you're getting your upside to win tournaments or even for cash. They're very intuitive, and I know some of you who are listening haven't been on the site, so just give it a shot. I don't think you're going to regret it. But go ahead, James. I had to plug it because I think you are very humble, and you otherwise won't do it as much as you should.
Yeah, you had to do it because I won't. Fair enough. So specifically talking to the idea of using exposure or edge, it's both. Exposure is still important. I usually focus a little bit more on edge. One of the first things I do is sort by edge to kind of see like who is undervalued. But in saying that, like from an exposure point of view, like I don't want to just ignore Alvin Kamara at 30%. I also don't want to ignore Christian McCaffrey at 16% just because he has a negative edge. The exposure rate I typically look at as if I were to MME in a portfolio, that's what I would want my cap to be on these players. It's usually how I look at it. But the big thing is if you eat negative edge, and we talk about this a lot in the showdowns, if you eat negative edge, you have to counteract it with positive edge. So if you play Christian McCaffrey, at the very least, you should be playing Devon Kane with him because he is canceling out the negative edge there. But to answer the question, it's both. I think that the exposure rates are telling you who is valuable, and the edge is telling you where you can find your leverage or your relative value. Let's see. Next one, in-depth. So in-depth videos from the same person. Yeah, if you check out the other stuff on YouTube, you'll find plenty of videos. I can do some linking of things later on as well. Let's see. How much weight are we putting in game totals? Game totals are wrong all the time. Ish. I mean, they're wrong-ish, but it's the same thing. I mean, John, do you want to answer this one? Because you use game totals.
I think it's Eric Johnson. I've met him. Yeah. But yeah. So like, I mean, game totals are wrong. Like, projections are wrong too. I still want to take a look at them, right? I still know what they say. Nobody's ever going to hit their projection. But on the dot. But yeah, I mean, like if you just look at like correlations between like stuff we can know before the game starts and fantasy points at the end of the game, game total is one of those things that history says we want to take a look at. Doesn't mean that like, yeah, obviously game totals can be off all the time, and we want to think about things like, is the game total affecting ownership maybe more than it should? But in other cases, like we're looking at Detroit and saying, well, they've got it's like a high game total and they've got a high implied point total, but they're seeing low ownership. Well, maybe we should say we want to play a little more Detroit than the field.
Yeah, I will point out as well for game totals that when they're wrong, but they are within a standard deviation of what they are projected out to be. That's kind of the point. You think of them the same way as you think of projections, just like John just said. It's very likely not going to be, but it will fall within the distribution curve of what we would expect these games to end up within. We know, based on a lot of data, that game totals that are over 50 points usually lead to really good scores. That's just what they do. There's a sweet spot where as long as it has a game total of at least like 45, this research is outdated. Please don't quote me on this, but this is the last time I looked at it. Game totals of 45 plus typically are the ones that end up in winning lineups. Game totals that are lower are typically producing less fantasy points. So it's still important, but it's you think of it the same way as you think of a projection, right? Is the team that's involved in this game total underpriced for the game total that is used? And that is a piece of the pie. It's not the only thing you should focus on, but it is a tool in the toolbox to decide on who you're stacking.
Yeah, the only other point I'll make on game totals is that I do think it's important not to double count. So projections usually will incorporate game totals fairly significantly. And so be careful not to be like, oh, this guy is, 4,500 and projected well, and it's in a great game total. No, like that's already usually part of the projection, right? Cool. So I don't think there's anything wrong with knowing that context, especially relative to ownership and pricing, but be careful not to overweight it either in the form of double counting.
Yeah, absolutely. Next question, Metcalf or Myers in tournament? So typically when I answer 1v1s, what I'm going to say is, what does the rest of your lineup look like? For the instance of this, I would say if you need more ownership, then you should play Myers. If you need less ownership, then you should play Metcalf. If you want to get even more reductive, if you're in a small field, you should probably play Myers. If you're in a large field, you should probably play Metcalf. The projections are likely going to be very similar across the industry. The ownership projections are likely going to have Metcalf at like a quarter of the ownership of Jacoby Myers. So it's more a question of relative value than anything else.
I was just add that like Metcalf's much more expensive. So like if you're looking at a lineup and trying to decide between like Myers and Metcalf, like I probably go Metcalf for a bunch of reasons. One, that he's just not going to see as high ownership because it's much harder to get to him because he's like $900 more expensive.
Yep.
I'll give you guys I'll give you guys a harder one that I was looking at this morning. And I agree it is totally dependent on the lineup. But a harder one I would say is Pickens versus Walker. They're the exact same price. If Walker to some degree is also, if you're not playing CMC in a weird way, he may be some leverage off of like the Niners. I don't know. Maybe it's pretty weak indirect leverage off CMC. But anyway, there's a lot of 1v1s. I don't even want to, I regret even bringing it up because I agree with you, James. Like it's mostly like, it's always on the context of your lineup, how big your field is, how much leverage you need, and how much you're willing to take a hit off of your median to get, an improvement on your ownership relative to the rest of your lineup.
Yeah, I would just say Pickens and Walker.
And I was going to say, we all love Pickens anyways. I had come to the same conclusion you guys did this morning because I was like, holy shit, Pickens has been going crazy now for like ever since Russ came back, right? And it's weird. I do think they're being like aware of the zeitgeist of the narrative around players can be an edge in of itself. Like people thinking Russ Wilson sucks and that he can't get any receiver to a GPP winning upside. Like that is usable. That is usable to take advantage on the field.
What does fade the public mean in NFL sports betting? So typically when a line is up and people are putting money on it, the public side or the square side is usually the side that is getting more public support but less money. The sharp side is the side that's getting less support but more money. There are a couple services that you can use that measure this kind of stuff. Frankly, they're not all that accurate. But like that you can use some info on that. That fade the public is really just like a term that people use when they want to sound smart, I think. It's not really all that valuable. If you have projection systems like we have over at Paydirt that tell you what side you should bet, then it doesn't matter if it's the public side or the sharp side or whatever the fuck side. It's just, you should just bet things that have a better chance to win than the odds that you're given. My picking stacks based on team totals or highest projected for a 20 max. The highest projected ish, it's slate dependent. It's very slate dependent. Stacks, I look at stacks two ways. I would like to spend as much money as I can on them if I have value at running back. If I do not have value at running back, I'm typically using value for my stack. That, again, is reductive, but that's kind of the way I look at it. Pablo, John, you got anything to add to that?
Like, how am I picking stacks? Is it based on total or 20 max?
Based on like team totals or projections, or like when you think about your stacks, what is one of the levers that you use to decide on where you're focusing?
I would say that I'm probably looking at like totals and like other information, right? Like ownership, I guess. Like, do I want to be, under the field? Like looking at like the Lions total, right? I'm like, well, I should, and their low ownership. Well, I should probably be over the field. That's kind of the way I think about it.
I agree with. For me, it's everything. It's team. The team total matters. The projection matters, and then my lineup ownership and where am I getting? What I'm usually asking myself in trying to win a GPP is like, where am I getting the leverage? Like, where am I? How am I beating the field with this lineup? Am I doing it? And I do think your stack is still, because your stack is correlated. If you're correlating it, if you're playing even a single, but for sure if you're doing a double, in NFL DFS, it is still like the easiest place to get the most leverage in one piece, right? Like you can get it by playing a wide receiver off a chalky running back on the same team. You can play it by playing a defense against a chalky offense. But I think the stack, like if I can, I find it exciting if I can find a stack that projects well and a good total at low ownership, because it's still the easiest place to get leverage off the field.
Next question. How about eat a dick, Neil? How about eat a dick? That's what I'll say. I went an entire baseball season purposely misspelling a pitcher's name. I don't fucking care about saying things correctly. Does Ingram's projection factor in Mac Jones? It does. It does indeed. Mac Jones is not a terrible quarterback. I think that most people think that he is, but that offensive system was just fucking awful for New England. And Jaguars, they have decent players, and Mac Jones, when he is on the field, he targets tight ends at an egregious rate, like a really high rate. So I think that Ingram at 5,500, is he a little expensive? Would I like him to be 4,800, 4,900? Yeah, of course. But his projection is fine, and Mac Jones is fine.
Yeah, actually, I didn't know how to interpret that question, because I was like, Mac Jones targets almost exclusively tight ends. So yeah. I didn't know if it was like, oh, is this projection so high because of Mac Jones, or is it too high because of Mac Jones?
No. Yeah, he thinks that the Evan Ingram projection is too high, which it's because he's a Pats fan and he hates Mac Jones just for reasons. But yeah, I mean, Evan Ingram at 5,200, like I wish that he was a little cheaper. I wish that like $500 cheaper, because things are so tight this week. But at 1% owned, man, against Detroit, like yeah, it's a great game.
I don't know, James. Though I don't know that he's going to be. I'm seeing him in some other places like as high as 8%. So
he won't be.
I think
I'll take the fucking.
Just telling you, that's what I'm seeing.
Well, those people are liars. Those people are trying.
My point is, I don't think he's going to be chalky by any means, because I think it's all going to go to the cheap guys, or some people getting up to Kelsey or Brock Bowers. Yeah, the one guy who actually may not be like quite as owned because he's 5,500, even though people want to play Jameis, is Njoku. Like he's pricey enough where like it's easier just to play what's his face, who's been really good, or people are going to go down to Moore. I have like a sneaky feeling Njoku is actually going to be like slightly under-owned.
Yeah, I actually agree with that. Last question that I'll take. Ding right here because of Squirrel Patrol. Well, motherfucker, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope that you enjoyed being here because of Squirrel Patrol. It was really nice to have him on. That is going to close this out. This I think is a really good week. I'm pretty excited about it. If you have not checked out everything over at Paydirt, then you should. There are day passes available, 24 hours, does not renew, for $5 if you want to go to check things out for NFL Sunday. Join the Discord. It's free. Follow all of us on Twitter. I only have my Twitter handicap here, mostly because Margaret made this for me and I'm bad at this kind of stuff. But we'll get like, people's things next time. But thank you guys so much for showing up and giving some support. John, I hope you had a good time.
Yeah, definitely. Good hanging out with you guys. Gonna go watch some UFC.
Yeah.
It's already been canceled, so if you did UFC DFS.
Well, I hope that somebody picks up some trophies, and hit us up if you got any more questions. Thank you guys so much, and we'll talk to you later.